So we've had a series of lectures at Aquinas that we've been running for a number of years now. We bring in speakers and they teach us, but also they form us. They help make us better, holier people. And I'm excited about the talk tonight. The topic of the talk is distraction, which is very timely because we have all our electronic toys to distract us. The talk will be delivered by Professor Joshua Hren, and he is one of the foremost young Catholic writers that we have in the country today. He's written a number of books. I won't go through all of the titles, but he's written one on J.R.R. Tolkien. He's written a book of short stories called In the Winepress, and he's also written a book called How to Read and Write Like a Catholic. So these are useful books that you might want to know about. He also has a penchant to co-found organizations with his collaborators. And so recently he's co-founded a Masters of Fine Arts program in creative writing at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. So that's interesting. And then before that, he actually co-founded the Great Books Honors Program at Belmont Abbey. And even before that, he co-founded something else. He co-founded a family in collaboration with his wife, Brittany. And that family now includes 3 students who are at Aquinas. So I think it's wonderful that such a nice family has chosen to join us at Aquinas. So we have much to be thankful for. So why don't we extend a warm welcome to Professor Joshua Hren.
Thank you so very much, and it is, of course, a blessing for our family to be at Aquinas. We've been homeschooling up until this year, and that was basically because even though we've lived in some of the most beautiful parts of the country, there's never really been a school that we could come in good conscience send our children to, so it's a tremendous grace and blessing to be able to not only do so in good conscience, but in spades, way beyond that, right? So we're so grateful. If we could, let's just begin with a short prayer. And this is a prayer written by St. Thomas Aquinas, patron of the school, to be said before a study. So we pray in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Amen. O ineffable Creator, who out of the treasure of thy wisdom has ordained 3 hierarchies of angels and placed them in wonderful order above the heavens, and has most wisely distributed the parts of the world. Thou, who art called the true fountain of light and wisdom, and the highest beginning, vouchsafe to pour upon the darkness of our understanding, in which we are born, the double beam of thy brightness, removing from us all darkness of sin and ignorance. You, who make eloquent the tongue of the speechless, instruct our tongues and pour on our lips the grace of thy blessing. Give us quickness of understanding, capacity of retaining, subtlety of interpreting, facility in learning, and copious grace of speaking. Guide our going in, direct our going forward, and accomplish our going forth through Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen. So I just want to make sure that I understand the contractual terms. From what I gather, I think that my recompense is that Mr. Barry is going to be elevating my daughter's failing grade. If this talk goes well, and if it goes so, then I think something like, I think we looked at a C, basically. So, I'm just going to begin assuming that none of you have read St. Thomas Aquinas before, which is totally fine, although you'll pay for it in the afterlife. You still have time. So I'm going to assume that you've not encountered him before, and partially for that reason, I made sure that there are copies of the section from the Summa that we'll kind of work through a little bit together at the end of the talk, but I'll begin by framing it and introducing it before we do a kind of more seminar style. So St. Thomas Aquinas builds off of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics in his attempt to define and describe what virtue is. And we need to first understand his understanding of virtue before we can proceed. He offers several different definitions of virtue. According to one very general account, he says that a virtue is a habit that disposes an agent to perform its proper operation or movement. Okay? Now, notice very importantly in that definition the word disposes, right, and the word habit. Right? So it's a habit that disposes. And what this means is that even though, right, we know that reason is the highest operation of human beings, it follows that just because we have reason doesn't mean that we're going to use it well. Right? Whenever someone says, well, man is a rational animal, the objection is always like, well, why is everyone acting like complete maniacs and totally insane and acting irrational all the time, right? And the response to that objection is that by saying that we have the potentiality to act rationally or to think rationally, that's not the same thing as saying that we're actually going to actualize that or complete that potentiality. But if we do habituate ourselves into its use and its right operation, then it becomes easier. So one of the most important things about Aquinas' understanding of virtue is that when we do acquire virtue, difficult things become easier for us to do. So it's not the case, as a sort of widespread fallacy would have it, that if something is harder for us to do, that means that there's more virtue in it. Or that if I have to kind of plug my nose to do the difficult task, that means that you should reward me more or pat me on the back more. Because after all, right, if it was easier for me to do, what merit is there in it, the argument would go, right? But for Aquinas' understanding of virtue, the opposite is the case. I should be able to do what is right and live and act excellently if I'm virtuous in a way that in a way such that I take pleasure in doing good. Right? I take the highest form of pleasure that we can possibly take in doing what is right, doing what is good. I don't do what is right and do what is good, plugging my nose the whole time and sort of trying to get through it because it pains me. If I were to do that, that means that I would still be doing a virtuous act, but I would not be virtuous. Right? Objectively speaking, if I'm making a just decision in meeting out a court case, right? If it took me an extraordinarily large amount of anguish to get to that decision, I still may arrive at a just decision, but I'm not a just judge. Okay. So, while all virtues contribute in some way to our rational perfection, not every virtue disposes us to live morally good lives. Okay? And Aquinas makes a distinction on this point that goes back to Aristotle between the moral and the intellectual virtues. So it's possible for someone to possess intellectual virtues, but to be totally deficient in moral virtues. Right? It's possible for someone to possess the theological virtues, right? Something like the virtue of faith, and to be more or less deficient in the intellectual virtues. It's possible, right, we could go through all these various combinations. But one of the ironies of this, of course, is that it's possible for someone to be a moral philosopher and to be totally immoral, right, in his behavior and his actions towards his family and towards his society. He could know all there is to know about temperance, and he could be intemperate, right? He could teach his students to be temperate, but he himself could be a glutton, for example. And so, while some virtues are strictly intellectual perfections, such as the ability to grasp universals, or the causes that underlie the world's origin and its operations, right? The first and final causes of things, there are other virtues that are related to moral decision and action. How do I know whether this action is just? How do I know whether this sentence is proportionate to the crime that's been committed? And in the case of curiositas and studiositas, which we're taking a look at tonight together, we have a kind of middle ground, really, between the moral and intellectual virtues. In that studiositas, right, the virtue of studying well, is not the same as actually growing in knowledge. It's the step that leads to growth in knowledge. Okay? And so it's a sort of halfway house between the moral and intellectual virtues. Aquinas also says, I should clarify before this little kind of prelude prior to the real talk here, that another kind of virtues, which of course Aristotle did not understand or have access to, the theological virtues can only be received from God, right? Only God can infuse in us these additional habits of something like faith, hope, and love. And these direct us towards our absolute final end, which is participation in the beatific vision with God in paradise. Whereas the moral and intellectual virtues, at best, lead us to a sort of natural happiness, or eudaimonia. And as Aristotle says at the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics, right, most people agree that there is such a thing as happiness, which is a good in and of itself, for which we do everything else. Right? But there's a lot of disagreement over what that happiness is. So a lot of people, maybe even most people, Aristotle says, assume that happiness can be found in very low and base animalistic pleasures. Right? Then there are those who seek happiness through honor, political life, for example, whereby you serve your country and then you're honored on a world stage. And then the third way of life is really the contemplative life, which he holds out at the end as the fulfillment of happiness on this earth. The most happy that we can be is when we're engaged in intellectual contemplation. Why, he says? Because that's the thing that we can do more consistently and completely and for a longer period of time than we can do anything else, right? So it's a kind of foretaste of a participation in eternity. But again, all of these natural virtues fall short of the theological or the infused virtues, which cannot be developed or stolen or won in any way by us. They're only given to us graciously by God, who directs us towards this final good. Okay, so that's again just a little primer on the virtues. So, the desire to see and to know are long-term human quests. And these quests to know and to see are celebrated in the opening of Aristotle's Metaphysics, which again, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend just chewing on it for breakfast on a Tuesday morning, preferably. And he begins the first book of the Metaphysics, Aristotle does, like so. All men by nature desire to know. An indication of this is the delight we take in our senses, for even apart from their usefulness, they are loved for themselves, and above all others, the sense of sight. For not only with a view to action, but even when we are not going to do anything, we prefer seeing, one might say, to everything else. The reason is that most of all the senses, sight makes us know and brings to light many differences between things. Okay. Now, I just want to pause and remark upon a few things. All men desire to know. Okay. So this is one of the loftiest books of philosophy really that has ever been written, Aristotle's Metaphysics, but he's claiming very clearly that philosophy is too precious to be left to the philosophers, right, or the professional philosophers, and it certainly doesn't belong in ivory tower professorships, right? Philosophy is something that concerns every single person in this room, insofar as all of us desire to know by nature. We can't not desire to know. It's just a question of whether we're going to know well or know badly, right? We cannot escape that. That's a natural telos that we are given, right, irregardless of what we do with it. And so all men desire to know. It's the example that he uses is very basic, right? We know that this is the case not because everybody picks up long treatises after they've had a hard day at work, but because everyone delights in the knowledge that even something like sensory experience gives them. Right? Okay. So Aristotle's initial kind of characterization of this desire to know presents it in a kind of uncomplicated way as a strictly good thing. But in Cicero's work, Cicero's a Roman philosopher who came after Aristotle. In his work De Finibus, he celebrates this same desire to know, but he also introduces something that he calls the lust for learning. And this is the mind's innate craving for learning and knowledge. And whereas in Aristotle's characterization, there's again a much more of an emphasis on the rational faculty. In Cicero, there's an emphasis on craving and a kind of the possibilities of the passions getting involved in our attempts to come to know something. He calls this descendi cupiditas, or again, the lust for learning. As his exemplary lover of wisdom, Cicero presents none other than Odysseus, the hero of Homer's poem, the Odyssey, and he interprets the famous passage of Homer's sirens, right, as givers of knowledge, and Ulysses' response to their invitation as praiseworthy. Just because, in case it's been a few days since you last read that passage in the Odyssey, he's talking about the part of the poem where Odysseus is trying to make his way home, and for goodness sake, he's already been to hell, and he's escaped that. And then that's not enough. He has to pass through the difficult decision of going closer to Scylla or Charybdis, which of course has become sort of part of our cultural nomenclature whenever we have a difficult decision to make. Right? We sort of try to choose whether it's better to have all of basically our men perish because they'll be sucked down into Charybdis, right, and the whirl will take them to the bottom of the sea and no one will live. Or maybe we should try to go and steer our ship closer to Scylla, in which case this six-headed monster can only take, right, 6 of our men, and then hopefully the rest of us will live. In other words, the lesser of two evils, right, or the greater good among the two difficult decisions. But around this same passage, Homer has Odysseus pass through the sirens, and the sirens woo all of the men who pass by here by promising them knowledge. Now, really importantly in the poem, they don't clarify what kind of knowledge they're going to give the men before they lure them in. They just tell them that they're going to bestow this profound knowledge on them. And Odysseus, Ulysses, is known for a number of vices and other things, such as lying. He's one of the world's greatest liars. But he's also known for his shrewdness and his thirst for knowing. And so he catches wind of this, and he can't resist. So he has, right, his men basically tie him to the mast of the ship so that he, when he hears them, will not be tempted like every other man has been who heard them to cast himself overboard, right? And he's able to listen to them. So Cicero uses Ulysses' quest as a kind of exemplary, heroic embodiment of human desire to know above all things. He's willing to embark on this difficult knowing of exposing himself to the sirens, even at the risk of his death. Right? Now, in Dante's Inferno, he picks up the same figure or passage of the character of Ulysses, and he gives us a different sort of angle or a different take on Ulysses. And I'm just going to read a little bit from the Inferno because it's really important to see the sort of the different kind of tone and shade with which he gives us Ulysses. So Ulysses is in the Inferno. This is down towards the bottom of hell. He's in the realm of the false counselors, right? This is the place where all of those who've kind of given bad advice either sort of trying to achieve some sort of gain for themselves or to ruin those who they're giving bad advice to. Right? And so Ulysses, to set up this scene, is being condemned in part for having given his men horrible advice. Right? This is a very different Ulysses again than we see in Homer. This is him talking here, straight out of hell. When I was freed at last from Circe's reach, who had detained me for a year or more near Gaetia, as Aeneas would name that beach, neither reverence for an aged father, nor a son's sweetness, nor the love I should profess to Penelope, which she would be happy for, could overcome my ardor to possess experience of the world and humanity, lust for all its worth and all its wickedness. So I'll pause there and notice that already here we have not this heroic hero of Odysseus who's trying to make his way home after being prevented from getting home, to be reunited with Penelope, his wife, who's faithfully waiting for him. Not the Odysseus who's concerned about his son Telemachus, who's grown up without a father, but the Odysseus who says, I forewent all of those goods that should have been basically my primary concern in order to experience this lust and foreknowledge and experience. I set forth upon the open sea with just one vessel from my fleet's remains and those few men who had not deserted me. We sailed both shores, Morocco's coast and Spain's, as far as Sardinia did we go, and the other islands which that sea contains. My mariners and I were old and slow when at last we reached the narrow channel lined by Hercules with his marks, so men would know that they must not go beyond the bounds assigned. All right. So the pillars of Hercules in this cosmos that Dante is giving us are the end of the world. Right? So his men, and he and his men have finally reached the end of the world. No one has ever gone past this point. You're not supposed to be able to, right? It's supposed to just be nothing. There's supposed to be nothing after this. And by the time he gets there, he's an old man, so are his traveling companions. So they've been, lusting after this knowledge and this experience for quite a long time at this point. He refuses to be satisfied. My mariners and I were old and slow when at last we reached it. On the starboard side, Seville now disappeared. On the other, Ceuta already lay behind. Through 100,000 dangers we have steered, my brothers, I said, to reach these western gates. Now has the brief vigil of our senses neared its close, so let us not forswear our fates, but embrace experience, tracing the sun's wreck to the uninhabited region that awaits. It's totally fine. Consider your origins. Living like a brute is not the destiny of men like you, but knowledge and experience ever our pursuit. With these few words of mine, my shipmates grew so eager to go on that even I could not have stopped them had I wanted to. Setting our stern against the morning sky, we turned our oars to wings in our mad flight. And they perish. So again, here we have a Ulysses, an Odysseus, who incites his men to this mad flight to uninhabited lands beyond the known world. Sailing the watery wastes of the southern hemisphere, he sees a mountain in the distance as his boat capsizes, the mountain of purgatory, a mountain that he will not be able to participate in. Unapproachable except by way of an angel's boat. And he cannot himself, again, get any closer because his curiositas has been his ruin. Okay. So we have then this kind of tension that we're witnessing between this desire to know that comes from our nature and the clear possibility and maybe likelihood that we will sort of misuse that natural good. And I think that, again, I'm just sort of trying to take us through a tour of the Catholic intellectual tradition and figures who have thought about this tension. And the next one, and I think the last one before we come to Aquinas, is St. Augustine. In his Confessions, he says that he had a pleasure to pursue beautiful objects, but this, he describes it as a curiosity that pursues these delights with the motive of seeing what the experiences are like, not with a wish to undergo discomfort, but out of a lust for experimenting and knowing. Right? So what Augustine is characterizing here is really exactly what we just saw happening with Odysseus in Dante. He doesn't want to undergo the difficulty of developing the virtue of studiositas, right? He just wants to be basically titillated with a constant exposure to ever new novelties of maybe philosophical thought or theological intrigues. Augustine is obviously extraordinarily brilliant, and yet it took him way over 10 years to move from a position of curious kind of wanderings of his mind all over the sphere of the available thought that he could get his hands on before he finally found the church and accepted it. What pleasure is to be found, he says, in looking at a mangled corpse, an experience which evokes revulsion. Yet, whenever one is lying, people crowd around to be made sad and to turn pale. This is basically the equivalent for us of something like the car wreck, right? Or any sort of other tragedy that we kind of notice out of the corner of our eye as we're walking down the street or driving down the road, right? You see some sort of unpleasant thing, but there's a way in which, even though it's unpleasant, it would seem to be bad to absorb it or to come to add it to the things that you know. We can't seem to resist it, right? We want to know more. They even dread, Augustine goes on, seeing this in their dreams, as if someone had compelled them to look at it when awake, or as if some report about the beauty of the sight had persuaded them to see it. The same is true of other senses. To satisfy this diseased craving, outrageous sights are staged in public shows. Sound familiar? Professional sports. The same motive is at work when people study the operations of nature which lie beyond our grasp, when there is no advantage in knowing, and the investigators simply desire for its own sake. Nevertheless, when so many things of this kind surround our daily life, Augustine says, on every side with a buzz of distraction, when, may I be so bold to say, when can I venture the claim that nothing of the sort tugs at my attention, and to go and look at it, I am not caught in any vain concern. And he goes on to say that, right, there are these times when he'll be preoccupied with some sort of lofty theological treatise. Let's say he's working on his treatise on the Trinity. And as he's trying to work on his treatise on the Trinity, he'll see these rabbits chasing one another. And he can't help but just let his mind go towards the rabbits. And the next thing he knows, he's completely forgotten the theological argument that he was going to make. Right? Now, there's one other instance that Augustine enumerates in this section on curiositas that's more complicated than those that we've covered so far. The example of Cicero, the example of Dante's version of Odysseus, and also Augustine's own kind of self-condemnation. And it's this. He says, when I'm sitting at home, a lizard catching flies, or a spider entrapping them as they rush into its web, often fascinates me. The problem is not made any different by the fact that the animals are small. And here it kind of reminds me a little bit of this wonderful passage in St. Teresa of Avila's Interior Castle, where she says that there is more mystery than we can possibly fathom, even in an ant. She doesn't mean that in the kind of pantheistic sense, but in the sense that God created these creatures too, these very small creatures, with such an immensity of mystery enshrouding them that we could contemplate even an ant, Teresa says, in the Interior Castle, for a long time, profitably. And so Augustine has the same experience, right? He's sort of letting his mind wander off, students in Dr. Denise's class over at Chesterton before he pulls out the ruler and starts, using corporal punishment to get them back into studiositas. Right, he starts out with this kind of wandering mind, but then he says that this fascinates me, and this sight leads me on to praise you, the marvelous creator and orderer of all things. But that was not how my attention first began. It is one thing to rise rapidly, another thing not to fall. Okay. When my heart became the receptacle of distractions of this nature, the container for a mass of empty thoughts, then too my prayers are often interrupted. And yet, the lizard can lift me to God. And so again, there's what we're seeing here is that it's a very sort of nuanced and complicated relationship between the vice of curiositas, which is this kind of wandering unrest of our spirits, and the virtue of studiositas, which is the virtue by which we especially are able to relate all of the particular things that we come to know to God. So that we look at all of the particulars that we encounter in our acquisition of knowledge, subspecie eternity, right? So under the aspect of eternity. And Aquinas, right? If you could bring out the handout, Aquinas sort of more systematically addresses this dilemma that we've been trying to give witness to. And again, he more systematically unpacks both the ways in which curiositas can come to distract us and the specific kind of species of curiosity, right? The specific ways in which we can badly know or fail to know rightly. And then, sometimes only by implication and sometimes directly, he tells us also what we can do to basically chasten our sight and to moderate our minds so that we can come to know rightly as we ought to. Okay, so what I'd like to do is just work through part of this together, not the whole thing, it's just really 2 pages, but we won't go through the whole thing because you could spend 45 minutes doing that. But just to give you a little bit of a sort of introduction to the way that Aquinas proceeds before we delve into this question. Again, I strongly encourage all of you to read Thomas as often as you can, and even 1 question per week would be a remarkable practice, right? Because the important thing about Thomas Aquinas and his thought is not entirely in the particulars of each of the questions that he's asking and the answers that he gives, but the habit of mind that you're able to develop when you're regularly steeping your own mind in his thought. And the form that he gives is especially instructive. So he uses a form called disputatio, in which he begins with objections to his own argument and his own position. Right? So you'll notice on the first page, we have objection 1, objection 2, objection 3 in bold. After he begins with a number of objections to the position that he already knows he holds, right, then he will move into an on the contrary. And the on the contrary is his appeal to an authoritative source outside of himself, which he appeals to in order to lend his own position greater authority. But as most of us know from studying logical fallacies in 4th grade, I'm sure you don't remember that. I didn't do that either, don't I? The appeal to authority is a pretty weak argument, right? You say, well, why should we save the whales, right? Because Oprah says so, right? It's not a very effective. What does Oprah know about whales? Absolutely nothing, right? And so the appeal to authority is fraught with all kinds of problems. But it's a little bit different in the Catholic intellectual tradition, we know, because right, we have not only the revelation that comes from sacred scripture, but the revelation that comes from capital T tradition. And so oftentimes, almost always, Aquinas Aquinas is going to, in the contrary section, appeal to one of the heavy hitters of the Catholic tradition, like St. Augustine, or in this case, St. Jerome, to kind of find someone who can prepare the way for his own position, if that makes sense, before he goes into it, in a more discursive or logical way. And then we have his I Answer That, where he finally gives his own thoughts and position on the question that's been raised. I would say it can be helpful when you're first familiarizing yourself with Thomas to begin with the I Answer That. Right? You go to the question whether curiosity can be about intellective knowledge, skip over objections, you go right to the I Answer That, you get his thoughts on the matter, and then after that, it can be helpful to read the objections, and then if you go to the end of the document, the replies to the objections in conjunction with one another, if that makes sense, right? So you read objection 1, you read the reply to objection 1 right after you read objection 1. Does that kind of make sense? Because if you proceed chronologically in an age of diminishing attention spans, then you're going to forget what the objection 1 was by the time you get to the reply to the objection, right? And by the way, I don't buy that, right? When I was teaching a couple of years ago, we had an in-service where we were told that we had to accommodate our lesson plans to our students' attention spans, and we were told that their attention spans at that time were 40 seconds. And so I respectfully asked the person who was giving us this expertise in service if she could please prepare the Iliad for me in 40 seconds. And the way that I dealt with that basically was, and I think that this is something that teachers are doing at places like Chesterton and Aquinas as well, is that yes, there is a crisis of curiositas in our time, right? Students, young people, even ourselves I forgot what I was saying. I'm sorry. Wait, just one second. Just one second. Right, and so, but there are two possible responses to it. One, we can dumb things down in order to accommodate, right, these diminishing attention spans. We can basically throw away our inheritance. Or we can develop these muscles of studiositas, these habits, whereby it becomes actually easy to pass through a question from St. Thomas Aquinas, right? It's not obtuse or difficult anymore. It's easy, or at least easier than it was when we first started. Okay. And so let's take a look then, just honoring this method, let's take a look just at the I Answer That. So whether curiosity can be about intellective knowledge. And just to paraphrase that question, what he's really trying to figure out is it possible for there to be a vice when it comes to knowing, right, with the intellect especially? He's talking about intellective knowledge especially, not the kind of knowledge that comes from, right, the senses at this point, right? So is it the case that there could be a vice, or is all knowledge that we encounter with intellect good knowledge? Okay, and he answers it by saying, studiousness is directly not about the knowledge of itself, but about the desire and study in the pursuit of knowledge. So that's what I was kind of getting at before when I said that studiousness is kind of a halfway house between the moral and the intellectual virtues, in that you're not actually, if you're developing studiositas, you're not, by developing it, growing in knowledge itself. You're not coming to acquire new knowledge while you're developing studiositas. You're coming to figure out how to acquire that knowledge. Okay. Now we must judge differently of the knowledge itself of truth and of the desire and study in the pursuit of the knowledge of truth. For the knowledge of truth, strictly speaking, is good, but it may be evil accidentally, by reason of some result, either because one takes pride in knowing the truth, according to 1 Corinthians, knowledge puffeth up, or because one uses the knowledge of truth in order to sin. Okay. Now, as we turn over the page, I'd ask you to pay special attention, because I'm going to be peppering you with a quiz. And again, your eternal salvation, you may not be graded on it, but your eternal salvation is at stake, so pay attention. But on the way there, I just want to note that, right, there can be a kind of anti-intellectual inclination among Christians And one of the reasons for that is because there are verses like this in Scripture, such as knowledge puffeth up, right? And if you sort of take that out of context and run with it, or you take something that Paul says about the false philosophies or false philosophers, right? And you run with it, it sounds pretty compelling. Yeah, knowledge puffeth up, right? I should just stick to my pious devotions, right? Separate from, right, any sort of pursuit of knowledge. Yes.
I'm sorry, I wonder if you could say a few more words
Yeah.
about what kind of knowledge is intellective knowledge.
Sure.
You could maybe give an example or two, like what's excluded, what's allowed, what's part of.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, strictly speaking, intellective knowledge would be any kind of knowledge that you're gaining whereby you're trying to have your mind correspond with reality, right? So it could be literally anything. If I'm looking at that upturned table and I notice that there's a kind of proportionality between the two sides, right, and then there's kind of a larger center, that's actually a form of intellective knowledge. Because it's not just sensory experience, my mind is involved in sort of interpreting it or analyzing it, if that makes sense. So it could be anything like from that to, trying to understand the nature of justice, to, trying to understand the best practices in accounting, to, right, it could be just a whole range of possible things, right? It could be,
So subject matter is anything.
yeah, like learning, Roman history or American history, right? It could be literally anything, as long as the intellect is involved. It could be the study of a play or watching a movie, right? Because even in that case, or watching a TV show, right? Because even in that case, you're not. It depends on how bad the show is, but like some shows, it really is just like stupefying you and just sort of satiating your senses at the expense of your mind. But in most cases, there's at least some demand on the intellect. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
I appreciate it. And any questions are very, very, very welcome along the way. So then he goes into kind of the specific ways in which we can kind of go wrong. And so I'm hoping that we can discuss together what these ways are, and then what are the ways by which we can kind of overcome those possible distractions or mistakes. So midway down the page especially, he says, right, so the first part, that first paragraph we'll skip because it's basically just an elaboration of what he means by pursuing knowledge just so that we can puff ourselves up and take pride in our knowledge, right? I spend my Tuesday evening, right, reading all that I possibly can about the vaccine situation, not because I actually want to take care of my family, but because the next day at work, I want to wow everyone in the break room about all of the knowledge that I have about this situation. They all look like idiots because they thought they knew what they were talking about, but I read all of the articles ahead of time, and they didn't, right? And I planned these nice questions so that they look foolish. Did you see, right? That would be an example of puffing myself up with knowledge. So secondly, there may be a sin by reason of the appetite or study directed to the learning of truth being itself inordinate, and this in 4 ways. First, when a man is withdrawn by a less profitable study from a study that is an obligation incumbent on him. Hence, Jerome says, we see priests forsaking the Gospels and the prophets, reading stage plays and singing the love songs of pastoral idols. Second, when a man studies to learn of one by whom it is unlawful to be taught, as in the case of those who seek to know the future through the demons. This is superstitious curiosity, of which Augustine says, maybe the philosophers were debarred from the faith by their sinful curiosity in seeking knowledge from the demons. Thirdly, when a man desires to know the truth about creatures without referring to his knowledge to its due end, namely the knowledge of God. Hence Augustine says that in studying creatures, we must not be moved by empty and perishable curiosity, but we should ever mount towards immortal and abiding things. And finally, when a man studies to know the truth above the capacity of his own intelligence, since by so doing men easily fall into error, wherefore it is written, seek not the things that are too high for thee, and search not into the things above thy ability, and in many of his works, be not curious. And I'll stop there. Okay, so now, of course, coming to understand our own propensity towards curiositas will require us to have self-knowledge by which we know which of these we would probably be more likely to be led astray, right, according to. But if you could kind of help me by putting in your own words these 4 ways by which we can we can basically go astray in the acquisition of knowledge. What are, and again, in your own words, what are the ways by which, the truth can escape us because our relationship to that truth is inordinate or intemperate? Take your time.
You want to just go through?
Yeah, just whatever one you are kind of drawn to, or one that you think you could, kind of put in your own words and maybe expound upon a little.
I have a question about this number 4. Man studies to know above the capacity of his own intelligence.
Yes.
I guess what I'm wondering is, would maybe your example about the vaccines would be a good one. I don't know anything about that, right? So if I just go to a news site and hear about that,
Yeah.
then I have no idea whether that news site is correct or not.
Right.
And I could be basically led into error or propagandized or just somehow led to believe things that aren't true but maybe also are bad for me, maybe manipulated.
For sure.
But it's hard for me to tell if that's what he's talking about here, or is it something different?
Well, I think so. I think that it's possible to be manipulated in the way that you're describing, not just because of, let's say, the exceptionally kind of high level of propaganda that exists in a lot of mass media. In other words, not just because of what the media itself is doing, but rather because we ourselves can come to it with this kind of curiositas and this puffing up of ourselves, so that we come to it kind of, we read the article, we leave it feeling like, oh my gosh, I now kind of understand this very, very complex issue, right? A war in the Middle East or something, and I know exactly what foreign policy should look like, for example, right? And I'll give you one example of that. It comes from kind of something along the lines of what I'm getting at, right? So it comes from this novel called The Moviegoer by the Catholic novelist Walker Percy, and the protagonist of that novel says, whenever I feel bad, okay, I go into the library and read controversial periodicals. Okay? And maybe you don't go to the library, but you turn on Twitter or whatever, and you have your version of it, I'm sure, right? I'm feeling kind of lousy, feeling kind of down. I'm going to go down the internet's, rabbit holes of conspiracy theory, whatever, and then I certainly feel better, right? I hate CNN, so I read CNN articles because it makes me mad. I feel kind of good that it makes me mad, right? I mean, we do these things, don't we? Right? Or, right? We wouldn't put it quite like that, but we would say, well, I'm reading it just to kind of stay abreast of what the other side is saying, and I like to keep myself informed. And we might tell ourselves, but secretly we're feeling kind of the pleasure of being able to kind of get angry. So Bing Spalding, this protagonist, he goes into the library, he says, and he reads controversial periodicals. Admittedly, he's kind of like an existentialist wanderer who doesn't really know whether he's a liberal or a conservative. And he says, nevertheless, he's, quote, enlivened by the hatred which one bears to the other. So he fancies himself, right, as being plagued by this sick attraction to this. Knowledge is not an end for him, but it's a means of titillating wrath. Let's say his dopamine has dipped. Right? He plunks himself down with a liberal weekly, and he nods at each point the author score. Darn right, he says, old son, shaking his chair in an impassioned approval. pour it on them. But then he snatches a conservative monthly, drops down into a new chair, and soon he's lost in the counterattack, sure that new points have sunk the opponents roundly. Eventually he emerges from the library, he says, with, quote, his neck prickling with satisfaction. Right? So that's, yeah, so it would be sort of a scenario like that, and that's an admittedly kind of caricaturous, extreme kind of form, but I think there are variations of this that we all are inclined to do.
I see like another version of the fourth one maybe is like when people don't stay in their lane, right? So like you have this with scientists, you know, who kind of go down the atheistic route, and really what they're doing is they're using their discipline. They think that because they have, you know, a PhD in molecular biology that they can somehow disprove the existence of God, when they're actually appearing pretty amateurish because they don't have
Perfect example.
the tools of the discipline, and so they're not staying in their lane.
Right, that's a perfect example, right? Yeah, good. Yeah, and I mean, and that also kind of is another maybe casualty of curiositas, because you know, in one of the parts of that I answered that, Aquinas says that everything that we come to know, we need to direct it to our final end, which is God, right? Now that's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, but he's saying it with sort of a straight face and a nonsense, but you still need to do it. And instead of relating, I think, everything to God, oftentimes even those of us who are not atheist scientists or whatever, right, are pursuing our own particular career and the knowledge that we gain in that career in order to advance our careers, which there's nothing wrong with that, right? But without relating the knowledge that might bring us a sort of more expertise to, let's say, ethical knowledge or, right, theological knowledge, so that we are maybe growing in sort of what is called best practice in our career without knowing whether that best practice is actually ethical. For example, right? And this happens all the time. But in addition to that, what it can do is it can sort of warp the man who's coming to become more and more kind of perfected and specialized in that knowledge. So Newman talks about this in the idea of a university, that basically, right, he's against specialization, because even though it advances the science of molecular biology, it destroys the soul of the man, right? Because he's so used to thinking of things in molecular biological terms that he projects it onto everything else, right? And I would add to that, this is another aspect of curiositas. Another thing that will come as a fruit of that is he's used to being the expert in his own field, and people come to him in his office and ask him important questions, and he's able to answer them with aplomb. And so then when he comes home and he reads the newspaper, he wants to feel that same level of certainty and authority about everything, even though most of the things that he's reading about he really doesn't know, right? In any sort of he doesn't know with the same level of depth, if that makes sense. I shouldn't say he doesn't know. I'm not making a case for like just relying on the experts or something like that. Does that make sense? Yes.
Doesn't both of these examples, the one that you cited, and that of the atheistic scientist,
Yeah.
there's a falseness in the sense that the atheistic scientist, when he goes down the road of thinking about something that isn't in his lane, he's an atheist first in that case, and a scientist second, in the sense that there's certain intellectual commitments that are already being made, and then in pursuit of knowledge is kind of being bent around to serve some other purpose than pure, perhaps, curiosity would do.
No, I think it
What
was. So I was thinking of, when in that example, I was thinking that he'd become, convinced that he was an atheist or something through his molecular biological pursuits or whatever. But yeah, no, you're right.
I mean, don't we do the same thing like things fooling? I mean, in his case, he doesn't know who he is or whatever. But
Yeah.
But often those of us who are conservatives doom scroll to find what,
It's a real problem.
for the purpose of affirming our own preconceived,
Yeah.
and, you know, this big lame type of knowledge, or to call that even a pursuit of knowledge is you know, really warping a bit of what knowing is.
It is, but it is still, right, see, I think you're absolutely right, but on the other hand, it still is knowing, right? I mean, so this goes back to Aristotle's metaphysics, where it's like we cannot desire to know, and so we are going to go throughout our days either habituating ourselves to, you know, 2 hours of the doom scrolling at the end of the day or whatever, or maybe 10 minutes of that, if you have to do it, and then, oh my goodness, like what about that other knowledge that Arshad was talking about, like looking at the tree in your backyard and how incredibly beautiful it is, and just resting in that. It's amazing how if you spend too much time doing these kind of rabbit hole things that you're talking about, and too much of reality is mediated through the screen, you can become easily convinced that we are actually already living in a thoroughgoing dystopia, and then you go outside and you say, oh my gosh, but there's no like helicopters arresting people on the streets. Like, is this the same world that I was just reading about? Oh my gosh, my daughter is still going sledding down the hill. Do you know what I mean? Like, you know. So I think I think it's difficult and it's complicated because you take the example of a lot of you know, Catholic yellow journalism, let's say, right? Like these sort of sensationalist things like Church Militant or something, right? Which I read sometimes, but the difficulty is that they are kind of, because they're more yellow journalistic, they're going to relentlessly pursue the truth about various scandals, and they're going to do a lot of good accidentally by exposing things that other people have just swept under the rug, pretending don't exist, right? But the means by which they're doing it and the effect that the presentation of that knowledge has on the people who are receiving it is very damaging, right? If that makes sense. Yeah. So the knowledge has been working.
With the fourth point, like trying to understand things above your intelligence,
Yeah.
do you think that's kind of like a mark of pride too?
Yeah, so I think it is, yes, very much. It's also, you could say, you know, which is similar, but could be provoked by envy or something, right? Like my best friend is, you know, a political philosopher, and I really want to be like him, and it's a good kind of emulation, but then I can go too far down that route. I also think, though, that the other side can be true, right? That it's not the case that we are trying to know things beyond our ken or our capacity, but that we are sort of selling ourselves short, right? We're assuming like, well, no, I'm not a PhD. Like, what do I know? Do you know what I mean? And then you can kind of acclimate yourself to that kind of laziness that Joseph Pieper talks about when he characterizes curiositas, which he calls as like a kind of acedia or sloth. And it's interesting, I just have to say that when Pieper was a kind of popularist Thomist philosopher of the 20th century, who's actually more of a Platonist than a Thomist, but he's always called a Thomist. He loves Plato. When he characterizes it, he says, as Aquinas says, that curiositas is connected with sloth, which is amazing because when you think about sloth, you think of somebody just kind of like laying there on the couch. There's a good old Milwaukee like six-pack, and they're kind of, you know, they're waiting for the sun to set, and they're in a catatonic state. But sloth is actually something that can be very deceptively hyperactive, right? So as Pieper says, right, like you can lose yourself in this kind of anxious pursuit of all of these different paths, and I'm going to cite the passage because it's so powerful, right? We surround ourselves with a restless, perpetual, moving picture of meaningless shows. Right? This is slothfulness that's doing that, right? A perpetual moving picture of meaningless shows, and with the literally deafening noise of impressions and sensations breathing breathlessly rushing past the windows of the senses. Behind the flimsy pomp of its facade dwells absolute nothingness. Sorry. It's so good. It's so bad, but it's so good. He articulates the problem so perfectly. It is a world of, at most, ephemeral creations. Now this, everyone in this room will nod in recognition of, which often within less than a quarter hour becomes stale and discarded, like a newspaper or a magazine swiftly scanned and merely perused. Right. So, again, I mean, and the problem again is, of course, if you are doing this every night, this is the mode that you're operating in, you have sort of two choices. You're either going to need to do more and more and more of it because it's going to become less and less satisfying, right? And even the doom scroll is going to be less satisfying, so then you got to kind of one-up it and do like History Channel documentaries or something, right? As like sort of like nourishing pursuit of knowledge, and you can kind of pat yourself because it's educational. You know, it's probably totally lies, right? And so, or you can again chasten, right, your intellect. What Keeper says at the end, right? He calls it an asceticism of cognition, right? So this could be something like fasting from, you know, I don't want to go into all the whole thing, stick on technology too much because you all know it, and it's kind of cliche. It's such a cliche, and we talk about it. We talk about what we should be doing and shouldn't be doing to the point that I think that's part of how we flatter ourselves that we're actually able to manage our social media better than we are. So I'm not going to make that claim here. But what I'm going to say instead is that I'm going to put in the pitch for recovering studiositas in part by doing things like buying a copy of The Interior Castle by St. Teresa d'Avila and reading one paragraph a night for a year. Right? And you will find, or taking one question of St. Thomas Aquinas, if your kids are at this school, he's our patron. Right? So we can go to him, he's our teacher, and taking one question and reading it very, very slowly, right? Almost like Aquinas has this wonderful image, I think, in one of his homilies, where he talks about like a cow chewing the cud. Like we can contemplate it, right? Like just very slowly. And what you'll find is actually then you go back to the kind of the stuff that you were talking about with the scrolling and stuff in it, and it's so it has become so unbearably vapid that you actually won't have the temptation anymore, and it will become harder to go down the vapid rabbit hole than it will be to read the Interior Castle of St. Teresa d'Avila, if that makes sense, right? And then you've developed that virtue, because again, going back to the beginning, a virtue is not just sort of doing it in a way that pains us, but doing it in a way that delights us, right? And again, of course, right, there is a time for all these different types of knowledge. That's what Aquinas says in the second part, I think, right? Priests forsaking the Gospels in order to read stage plays, right? Now, like if I went over and I knocked on Father Lynn's door right now, and he was, watching a Shakespeare play, my first response would not be to wave my finger at him and correct him and say, what are you doing not reading the Gospels? But if the next morning, right, the homily was not written, right, then we have a problem, right? So you see, so this is what he's saying. He's not, what he's dealing with here is this scenario where it actually, this vice and this virtue maybe become most consequential for us, not when we're dealing with situations like the dumb CNN comment section or whatever, but rather when we're dealing with multiple goods, right? And discerning when we ought to pursue this good versus that good, if that makes sense, right? When we ought to, how much time we ought to allot to reading Shakespeare, right? Versus reading something about, the vaccine, because after all, what the heck, we have to figure out, what to do with our families, right? So does that kind of make sense? But again, I'm convinced that so much of the Catholic world right now, because we live in such a time of confusion and crisis, has taken the option of these very shallow kind of waters and swimming around in those when we have St. Augustine's City of God to read, when we have Scripture, right? When we have all of these things that we can sort of, be these nourishing texts that literally are inexhaustible, if that makes sense. Yeah, any other?
It isn't too often that I take Peter Hunt above Aristotle, but in this case, I kind of have to agree with you. Okay, so Aristotle says we all have a desire to know, but it seems to me oftentimes we don't have a desire to know. Like, we're just kind of lazy and we don't want to read St. Teresa of Avila. And lighting that fire,
Yeah.
I mean, this is, I presume, a continual problem at Aquinas, right? I mean, you want to light that fire, you want students to be really interested in things, and sometimes we're just kind of bored by it.
I think at Aquinas they don't call it lighting the fire, it's called electroshock therapy. If the students are not engaged on that, I'm just kidding. But
So-
yeah, your point is well.
Okay, so let me, okay, and I think it becomes like a serious problem. So let me give one example, which is the spelling bee, right? So learning how to spell is really boring, right? It's intellectual knowledge, but who's interested in that? Nobody, right? So then what do? We say, okay, we'll gamify it, right? We'll make it into a contest, and that'll make it more fun, it'll incentivize people to study.
Sure.
But then what's the problem? The problem is that the students are being taught to like puff themselves up with pride. Oh, I won the spelling bee, right? And then they're not really learning it for the right reason, but then the right reason is really hard. So if
Yeah.
somebody's gonna spend hours studying to spell it,
I mean, my initial response to that is, well, I'll let you go first and then I'll respond.
Yeah, so I think
It's a great.
I think there's a couple things going on there. I think one thing that's going on is everyone has a desire to know, but sometimes we just stuff it with banal things, right? Easier things, like you can't not want to know, just like you can't not desire what's good. You can't not desire happiness, right? So you just there's an ordering of those things, and it's harder to know the higher things. But I think with the game thing, things are received according to the disposition of the receiver. And so like with kids, there's the pedagogy, you go from external motivators to internal motivators.
Yeah.
And so like when they're younger, you make it a game to walk them into slowly year after year. It's kind of like the Old Testament versus the New Testament, right? The law is external, commanded, but then the new law is written on our hearts by the Holy Spirit. And so the highest motive for wanting to do something is because you feel like it, right? Because then all of your senses are in line. But to get there, you have to appeal to, there's an external motivator, and then you gradually walk them into more internally motivated desires.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I would sort of take probably a middle road between the two positions that you both just very helpfully articulated, which is that, I think that the gamifying of things can be taken too far into the kind of edutainment route, so that then you actually aren't just delivering to the mode of the receiver. You're basically, you are letting the entertainment-ification of our culture take over our children, right, if that makes sense. And so, but I think that Alistair McIntyre's distinction in After Virtue about the internal versus external goods of different practices is very helpful in this regard. For example, right, he says that if you're teaching your child how to play chess, right, you're going to bribe them with candy, right? So my daughter, for example, she's like, "Where's my candy? We're going to chess." My daughter, I think, I couldn't believe it. I can't believe that you did this. God help you. But you were 8 years old and she memorized the soliloquy from Hamlet, right? And I think that happened because I told her that I would get her ice cream. Do you know what I mean? And so was it bad that I offered her ice cream? Shouldn't I have just sort of said, don't you recognize that this one of the like, where's your heart and where's your soul at, right? Like, if you're not enjoying this, something's wrong with you, right? And so in that case, both were true, right? She was rewarded with this external good, but she still experienced the intrinsic good of that memorization, of that partaking of that soliloquy, if that makes sense. But to clarify, right, I think that your first point about like you're not sure whether people are actually all really driven to know or desire to know. I think that it's part and parcel of, I mean, to elaborate a little bit on like what you said about like the banal, sometimes it's just coming to know in a very banal way. Literally, to go back to metaphysics, the example that he gives is just like the delight we take in sense perception, right? So I think his point would be that we wouldn't voluntarily put ourselves into dark rooms with straitjackets on, with earplugs in, so that we would, you know, because we wouldn't, it would be so contra nature to like eliminate the acquisition of at least sensory kind of levels of knowledge, right? Does that kind of make sense?
Well, I was thinking, I thought was Peter was kind of alluding to, is that oftentimes we just try and defend a pre-existing conception. Maybe it was the other Peter who was there. But you know what I'm saying? And so, I mean, I notice this a lot, frankly, among scientists. You think, oh, they want to actually know how something works,
Sure.
but no, they got a pet theory.
Oh,
They
sure.
don't just defend it to the death. And so they're not actually interested in knowing the truth of it, they just want to, you know what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely, but what's happening in that situation, sorry,
No.
what's happening in that situation is precisely what Aquinas is getting at, where, right, they have, let's see, those who study to the knowledge of the truth having some forsaking virtue and ignorant of what God is, and the majority, sorry, I'm trying to...
Those who study to know the truth that they may take pride in their knowledge.
Yeah, basically, right. So, and so in that case, the example that you gave, the person is still actually taking pride in knowledge. Do you know what I'm saying? Even if they are rehashing, trotting out the same kind of talking points for a decade, there's some way in which they are still it's in a deviated kind of warped way, but they're still delighting in what they are purporting to be genuine knowledge, or at least the appearance of knowledge in front of other people, if that makes sense. Does that kind of make sense? And so I think, just real quick, I think that sort of ties into Aquinas's, you know, I mean, his ideas about knowledge here are kind of similar to his ideas about, you know, the good as well. Like, all of us are inevitably always pursuing the good. And then whenever I talk about that with my students, they say, what are you talking about? Right? What about criminals? What about people who do acts of evil? And Aquinas' response to that is that in every single one of those cases, there's an apparent good that they have perceived and they've rationalized themselves to see in that evil, right? So they don't, it's objectively evil, but they have got to the point where they have rationalized it into a purported good, if that makes sense, right? So, you know, I could, yeah, if that, does that...
I think I'll have to think about it, but I guess I'm thinking about the case where someone says, well, you know, I know vaccines are bad, and I don't want to hear any evidence to the contrary.
Sure.
And so they really don't want to know the truth about it. If they really wanted to know the truth,
I see what you're saying.
you know, and so there are people who,
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's it. You know, I wonder, yeah, I don't know if that fits into any...
Yeah, I was trying to figure out, I mean, it's the priority is on in this case, on the commitment. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Right, it sounds like you're just talking about willful ignorance, right?
yeah, I think so.
Yeah. But it's interesting to note that you have to kind of be willful about it even, right? Even just the sheer fact that you have to be willful shows how hard it is in a way, right? To get to that point, because again, naturally you're so inclined towards, right? But you can habituate yourself into willful kind of repudiation of or ignoring of the truth to an incredible degree, to the point that...
Yeah, so like what came to my mind when Vincent, you were talking about like this, not everyone really wants to know. My first thought went to like, you know, like the hillbillies who like, you know, they just like drinking beer and watching shows. And
They like to know what it tastes like.
Exactly, right? So there's a dulling of the higher types of knowledge. It's been replaced by the indulgence in, you could say, like sense knowledge.
Right. Yeah. Now, again, as we're saying that, just like when we were talking about the comment section, just because there's a kind of manichaeistic inclination in so much contemporary Catholic thought, I just want to make sure that we're not saying that like partaking of a glass of beer is bad. Right? That's a natural good that God has allowed us to make, and it's a really good thing that we should rejoice in, right? So it's again, I think it's probably good for us all to make the hierarchy between like these low pleasures and high pleasures, and then like the ones that are even just base and not even good versus the low that are actually still good. Does that kind of make sense, right? So that, and then you have a kind of vacillation across these various goods throughout the course of the day.
When he lists points, like first through fourthly, is he listing them as like in order for a reason, like not just 4 equal points, but one being, like, because as I read point number 1, firstly, when a man is withdrawn by less profitable study from a study, there's an obligation incumbent upon him. So the obligation incumbent upon us is to know, love, and serve God. So when we drift from that, like our heart drifts from that to, let's say, mediocre things,
Yeah.
is that the start of the other points, like second,
I see what
third,
you're
and
saying.
fourth? Is it like, does it flow in that order, or is it just 4 equal?
It's 4 sort of different, kind of almost like subspecies, so to speak, like of that. So these are 4 different ways by which our appetite or study directed to the learning of truth can become inordinate, if that makes sense,
Yeah.
right? So they're sort of distinct.
I was just wondering, which of these is Adam and Eve guilty of? I mean, here's God giving humans the ability to think and to have curiosity for knowledge, and yet that's exactly what got him in trouble.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely be the third one. So one thing I want to clarify too here, by the way, is that there are certainly, an Aquinas would, if I could sort of somehow raise him back from the dead and prop him up and bring him here in front of his microphone, I believe that he would say that this is not an exhaustive list of the ways in which one. This is the Summa, right? And amazingly enough, right, he said that this is a beginner's guide, right? So it's not exhaustive. But I would say most definitely it would be knowing that a man desires to know the truth about creatures without referring his knowledge to its due end, right? Namely the knowledge of God. Right? It would fit into that category. You remember, even though we're Catholics, I hope that we remember that in the book of Genesis, the fruit is described as being right, lovely to behold, and it's not. That wasn't an illusion, right? I mean, that's not, Satan didn't come and foist this sort of lovely to behold quality on the fruit. That was innate in the fruit. So it was good. It was a created thing that God had made. But it was there are 2 things, I guess you could say, right? It was pursuing it certainly at the wrong time. There may have come a time when God would have permitted it, but at that time he asked us not to, right? And we wanted it now, if that makes sense, right? So Aquinas kind of talks about that, right? The priest who's studying when he should be preparing for his homily. And then, desiring to know the truth above the capacity for our own intelligence. In that case, right, what was the logic that was used by the tempter was that this will make you to be like gods, right? So I presume that Adam and Eve had some understanding of that being above their present state as just mere mortals, and so they were trying to go beyond it. So I think it fits into a couple of them, maybe. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yes.
I have a question about recognition, if you could speak to it a little bit. I think it's pretty easy to recognize when you might be falling into the error listed under second or third. But what about fourth? How do you recognize that you're falling into that error?
When something's too high for you, is that what you're saying?
So, yes, when do you recognize that? Because shouldn't we not be striving?
Yeah. So whenever, in 3rd grade, if a child is consistently getting a C on something, they should be taken out of that class. They should be put into a self-esteem room. I'm just kidding. No, it's a really, in seriousness, it's a very good question. I mean, because on the one hand, I think you could say that you kind of won't know until you try. Is that kind of what maybe you're getting at, right? Like, you can't say, well, that's probably just too high for me, right? But it is possible that you could sort of surreptitiously every evening sit down with War and Peace, and it just is the case that that's just too challenging, right, for that person's mind. And so I think they would come to know that, right, over time, just by finding that the inclination towards distraction was so great in spite of the heroic efforts towards acquiring knowledge, if that makes sense.
Sure, so what you're saying is maybe outcome, looking for an outcome.
Yeah, outcome, and then your own interior state, like while that's being pursued, and it would make sense that it would be challenging for a time, for a while, right? You might, if you're acquiring something with a greater depth of knowledge, for a while, it's going to require more work, and you're going to go to bed with maybe even a headache, right? Do you know what I mean? Really, or just more tired than usual, or something like that, right? But if that's happening after months and months of effort, right, then I think there would be a case to be made for avoiding that. And it probably goes without saying, but just in case it doesn't, I mean, no one needs to read literature or philosophy in order to be saved. No one, you have St. Anthony of the Desert, who was not a very learned man, intellectually speaking, but he's certainly a shoo-in in heaven in a way that I'm not. Right? Does that make sense? Right? So,
It does.
and then, it's interesting, no one brought up, which I'm glad, the pursuing of knowledge by magic and by relying on demons. But, and part of that is just because maybe we live in a more secular age, right, supposedly, but I actually think that even though maybe you all are not tempted in that way, it's a very sort of pervasive phenomenon with the growth of sort of the nuns and like non-institutionalized religion, that a lot of people are pursuing knowledge through psychics and sort of spiritualist practices of this sort that Aquinas is talking about. And so I think it's a mischaracterization if we continue to talk about our world our age as a secular age, because I think it was maybe in the dominant culture disenchanted and secular for a time, but people are naturally also drawn towards spiritual things, and oftentimes in a deviated way. And so there's an attempt to try to find out knowledge through psychics, right, Santeria, right, all these different sort of possible spiritualist practices. Yeah. And then also, Pieper brings up an interesting example with the regards, which I think is very worth our just taking a look at here. I know we probably come back here, but I don't know if anyone has the Pieper handout, but just in case you don't, I'll read this part where he says that immoderateness and striving for knowledge, Aquinas sort of exemplifies it by talking about magic, but it can also take the shape of claiming on our part that we can decipher God's movement and intentions definitively and with certainty in history and in our lives. Right? So we may sort of claim that God has manifested his intention in this reward or this punishment or this confirmation or this rejection. Right? Now, I was talking about this passage with the Canadian novelist Michael O'Brien, and he kind of pushed back and said, well, surely what Joseph Pieper means here is not that we should just cease from trying to discern God's movement in our lives or in history altogether. And so I do think that, again, there's a possibility of doing it in a way that's more inclined towards curiositas, which would be, the kind of maybe habituation into somebody who says, like, oh, that's a sign, or like, I know that this is God's affirmation of something that I actually just feel and I want to do, or something like that, or a desire that I have. And probably also, it would be a dead giveaway if someone was regularly saying that they saw the movement of God's hands everywhere. Right? I mean, maybe St. Joan of Arc, but the rest of us, probably not, right? And so I think it's a razor's stance that you're kind of pivoting on, as with all of these things, where there's a version of it that is inclining us towards immoderateness, and then there's a need to not, right, sort of go so far into temperance or asceticism of the sense of the intellect that you would sort of say, well, in the past I tried to see God's movement too much, and so now I've sort of become passive, and I actually conceive of God as like a deistic sort of, you know, removed, aloof kind of figure who's not active in human history almost, right? Because in my younger days I was a charismatic, and now I'm scared of what I did when I was a kid. Do you see what I'm saying? And so now I'm going to go to the other extreme or something like that, if that makes sense. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Any other comments or questions?
Maybe, I'm sorry, one final question. So when we go back to our families, what advice should we be giving them? It sounded like earlier you were saying, if we can just, you know, elevate ourselves, read something like St. Teresa or whatever, then hopefully after a time of that, then reading CNN will seem boring. And maybe to get to that point where we are actually able to read St. Teresa d'Avila, maybe we need to give ourselves some help, you know, some little reward for doing that. But I'm wondering, like, could you summarize, like, what tidbit should we tell our families when we go back home?
Well, I think, you know, in the case of pursuing whatever text it might be, one thing that I would strongly encourage is doing so in friendship. You know, and I know, of course, there are book clubs and things like that that can be really good, but they can also be, from what my wife tells me, just where like all these moms get together and drink wine and, you know, I'm grateful for not changing diapers for 15 minutes. I'm just teasing. No, we're reading Tolstoy. No, but in seriousness, I think that the goal is to come home from work, bring out the chocolate, just have everybody gorge on it, and then sit down in front of Fox News and CNN alternately all night. I'm just kidding. Oh, okay, now I'll get serious. In seriousness, I would say, yeah, in friendship, right? So, because your point about like sort of the risk of this being sort of experienced as something kind of stale, and I'm not going to actually take joy and delight in reading this great spiritual classic by St. Francis de Sales or whatever, right? But the likelihood that you will, if you're reading it with one friend who you have from the parish, increases tremendously, because that eros of learning, that love of learning, the desire, the impassioned desire of learning is stimulated, because you know that it's not just happening in a sort of vacuum or in a chamber with yourself. Maybe it's happening with you and your spouse, where you're reading a passage from City of God together in the evening, right? Or something like that. Maybe it's happening with a friend after Mass, so that instead of, you know, talking about the headlines, you're talking about Augustine's Confessions, right? Or something like that. And does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
So, and then in terms of your children, I mean, this is, you know, I've not been as good about that this semester because I've been putting in long weeks, but for years we've tried to get into the habit of reading like Don Quixote together and just laughing a lot together through it, because it's just nourishing good literature, right? It's something that they all actually seem to genuinely, they're winking and smiling right now, enjoy, right? Did I pay you? They say yes. This is your cameo where you say, yes, we do love these great books. But they actually do, and they did, right? They love the jokes in Don Quixote in a way that blew my mind, because I thought that would be stretching them too hard. It would be something too high for them, if that makes sense. But I was able to kind of experiment, and sometimes the experiments went badly, where we were introducing things too early, and then we had to just wait 2 years, 4 years, if that makes sense.
Are there any other questions? Why don't we thank our speakers?